we've had, what is it, 4, 5, I've lost track, 4 or 5 sessions, really looking at those key pieces that we've got to put in place. So now we come to the point of, okay, we can look at things in Scripture in a different light that should be fitting into the same picture, shouldn't we? So that's what we're going to start and have a look at. So let's look at putting it all together. We've had a look at Yeshua, the living word, the living Torah. We've had a look at where the new covenant appears and what it's about, haven't we? The new, or in Hebrew, the renewed covenant in Jeremiah is very specific. It puts the Torah within us. And when Yeshua came, he modified that in a couple of ways. Yes, he modified it because there's no sacrifices. And there were a couple of other modifications, one of which was putting it inside us rather than outside us. But other than that, that covenant hasn't changed. It's now a living thing within us. And all the apostles understood that. So that was the first piece which we dwelt with in quite some length. We looked at Paul's writings and remember how some of those can be totally misconstrued. We then started looking at these two aspects. How we can use Scripture as a dictionary and understand the words that it's using correctly. Otherwise we make up our own meanings and get hopelessly off track. And how we should interpret Scripture because it's a Hebrew document. Both Gospels were originally in Hebrew. Our English version has come through Greek, we know, but there is still the Aramaic version. And there is a Hebrew Matthew Gospel, Matthew Shem Tov Gospel. So we need to understand how Hebrews think and interpret Scripture, and that's those 4 different levels, remember. Incidentally, the Peshat level, the Remez level, the Drash level, and the Sod level, all of which never contradict each other. If you take and make an anagram of that, you know what I mean by an anagram, taking the first letters of each word and putting them together. We do that a lot in English for things. If you do that with those levels, you get a word that's in Hebrew, Pardes. And Pardes means paradise. Isn't that amazing? We looked at, remember, the Sod level, how you can actually find hidden things in Scripture that are dealing with a knowledge of either the number values of the Hebrew letters or a number value of the phrases. We'll have a brief look at some of that this afternoon. We can only touch on little bits. It's a huge area now that we're going into to sort of click everything in Scripture into this pattern. And I certainly haven't got through all of it, but we have got some bits and pieces that we can share with you. Okay, so we looked at those 2 extra bits. We then went on to look at who truly are Yahweh's people. Remember, why does Paul say that you were estranged from the feasts and the covenants and even Yahweh himself when you were outside the commonwealth of Israel? And that's meaning what it says. We don't spiritualize things. Remember, the Parshat level says what it writes, what it's there, that's what it is. And there are hidden levels possibly underneath that, but it won't contradict that. So we had a look at who Yahweh's people truly are. We had a look at the history of Israel, which led us to, right down to today, knowing where Israel truly is. And we had a brief look at that phrase of Paul that says, not all who are Israel are Israel. Yahweh sees a particular Israel. The world sees a different Israel. And yet they're both the same peoples. Isn't that interesting? So we've had a look at those. Finally, we had a look at what really Yahweh's plans and his kingdom were about. Because unless we understand the kingdom and where it's established and how it's established, we don't really understand how we can walk in elements of it now with the fullness to come. So we've looked at all those aspects. Now, those are the central 5 pieces of the puzzle. You might remember in the first series I had a red piece in the middle, which didn't fit. Remember we said that's what often we start out with. We start out with pieces that we have in the puzzle. They don't really fit with other pieces that we have quite, but we either ignore the differences where they don't fit because we like that piece, or it could be pieces, and we don't want to get rid of that piece. But until we're brave enough to say, well, Father, you put the right pieces in place for me so I do understand, then we don't get the true pattern that is there for us to find out. Once those pieces are established in our understanding, we can now start looking at all aspects of Scripture that are there in all the other books. For example, we can have a look at Bible prophecy, because that's now a piece that's building around these. And we'll have a look at a few prophetic pieces in Scripture. We can also have a look at Yeshua's parables. In a different light, we start seeing more things and sometimes different things about his parables, or certainly some of them. We can start looking at Yeshua's miracles. He did lots of miracles because he had compassion for the people, but they were always there with another meaning as well. But we don't see that other meaning unless we see the 5 pieces correctly put in the middle. And the healings that he did. We're going to touch on a few of those because they also are teaching things. Remember, Hebrew is an action language. Yeshua did things, and part of what he did was not just because, he felt sorry for the people. He did them because he was teaching them at the same time. So we're going to have a look at some of these. Let's start with the Bible prophecy. Okay. You may remember an instance after Yeshua was crucified and died that a number of the apostles said, well, I'm going back fishing. Basically, their world was destroyed as they saw it. They had no idea that he had been resurrected. So they went back to their old trade, back to what they did. And they were fishing all night, remember? Caught nothing. And then Yeshua came on the shore and asked them if they'd caught anything. And they said, no, we haven't caught a thing all night. He said, throw your nets over the other side. So they threw the nets over the other side. And remember, they caught so many fish that they could hardly pull the nets in. And then they recognised who it was. And so they went to shore, pulling the nets with them. It's interesting, when they got there, Yeshua was already cooking fish for them. It wasn't the fish they caught, he was already cooking it for them. And there's bits in there too. However, he got there. Now, several Gospels record this instance. But remember I said each Gospel is written at one of those Hebrew levels of understanding? John's Gospel is the deepest level. And in John's Gospel we read that 153 fish were recorded as being pulled in. I've no idea who counted them, and I've no idea why. Wonder if they knew why. But it's recorded there. Nothing's in Scripture that shouldn't be there, right? Okay, so let's have a brief look at... Here's the incident. I've just taken a small segment of it. Yeshua said to them, throw your net over to starboard. Well, in Hebrew it's really throw it over the other side. And you'll catch some. So they threw their nets in. There were so many fish they couldn't actually pull it aboard. Okay? Here's John's version here. Yeshua said, bring some of the fish you have caught. So Simon Kepha went up and dragged the net ashore, and it was full of fish, 153 of them. But even with so many, the net wasn't broken. Now, 153. This is at John's Gospel, so it's at that sowed level. What is 153 significant of? Now, unless you connect at this level, which means understanding Hebrew, or, we'll get onto it shortly, understanding Scripture from a Hebraic source through someone from the house of Judah. That's another way. Okay, you don't pick what it is at all. But there is a phrase in a prophet called Hosea. Hosea was sent to the northern kingdom. It's actually quite important to know which house of Judah or house of Ephraim, house of Israel, those prophets were sent to. Because it makes a great difference in understanding the message, because you know who it's actually being spoken to. It makes a huge difference. So let's go to the prophet Hosea. Chapter 1, or some versions will have it as the first verse of chapter 2. Here's how it reads. Nevertheless, the people of Israel will number as many as the grains of the sand of the sea. Here's the first hint. This is the Remez level. What was Abraham promised? That his descendants would be like the stars of the sky and more numerous than the sands of the sea. Here's the same phrase. In Hebrew, it's exactly the same phrase. the sands of the sea. So you know Hosea is referring here to the descendants of Abraham, i.e. Israel, in some form or another. If you know that he went because he was sent to the northern kingdom, you know that he's speaking to the house of Israel, the house of Ephraim. That's important. These details are important. Okay, let's go on. Which can't be measured or counted, so that the time will come, instead of being told you are not my people, which in Hebrew is lo ami, it will be said of them, you are the children of the living Elohim. Now this is from the complete Jewish version, I think it is. Most versions will say, you will be called the sons of the living Elohim. Okay, it's just a matter of translation from the Hebrew. That phrase, you are the sons of the living Elohim, if you add up the values of the letters, comes to 153. So what is this incident showing us? Here Yeshua did something and the disciples were obedient. They hauled the fish in. Remember, they were called to be fishers of men. Here they are back and doing ordinary fishing. Yeshua is showing them, hey, hold on, I don't want you to be fishing fish out of this lake. I want you to be fishing out of the seas of the nations, because they were called to be fishers of men. Okay? Why? How do you get all that out of that? Well, he's already told them they were going to be fishers of men. They knew and understood the nations were pictured in Scripture as the seas. What were they supposed to be finding? Those who would be part of the restored Israel, who in Scripture they are called the sons of the living Elohim. That's what Hosea is referring to here. Because Ephraim, first of all, was told no longer through Hosea's children, no longer would they be blessed by being part of Yahweh. They wouldn't be his people anymore. No longer would he have compassion on them, was another child. And the other child was, there would be a harvest of Jezreel. First there would be the scattering, but later there would come a harvest. And so Hosea at the end of all that says, okay, you're not a people, he hasn't got compassion on you, and yet in the very place where you're called not a people, you will again be called sons of the living Elohim. So these disciples were told to go out and find those ones who were the sons of the living Elohim. A whole picture just in that little incident, you see. Far more than we've understood before. But unless we understand those first 5 pieces, you don't pick it. And in some cases, unless you understand some of the Hebrew, we don't understand. Okay, let's move on and have a look at something else. A few more prophetic words. Interesting how we call it an Old Testament when huge amounts, massive amounts of it haven't actually been brought about yet. Prophecies still have to be seen to have occurred, and they haven't. And we call it a New Testament when half of it or more is actually quotes out of the Old. Interesting. Okay, here's one from Zechariah 9:13. For I have bent Yehudah as my bow and made Ephraim its arrow. I will arouse your son Sion and make you like a warrior's sword against your son's Greece, or O Greece in some versions. Okay, so here's a prophetic statement by Zechariah. What's he saying? Because this hasn't come about, but it's coming about in today's world right now. You know, if any of us have gone into the Old Testament, and that's our problem, in many cases we don't, but if we have, we begin to understand the New far better. Well, we know there are 2 parts to Israel, Judah or Yehudah and Ephraim, right? Anyone here done any archery at all, or bow hunting? Done a little bit of hunting? I did a bit of archery. If you're given a bow and told to go hunting, it's not much help. If you're given an arrow and told to go hunting, it's not much help either. Unless you can throw fairly good distance and hard. You have to have both, don't you? A bow and an arrow work together. Yehudah as a bow, Ephraim as an arrow is indicating these 2 things have to go together. Now at the moment, and for many, many centuries, they haven't been together. But we're coming into times now when both houses are waking up to who they are, and they will be put together. What are they supposed to be doing? They're supposed to be like a warrior's sword against your son's Greece. What have we been talking about in the first couple of sessions? The differences between thinking in a Greek or Roman Greek pattern compared to thinking in a Hebrew pattern. What this is saying is when you start joining the things of Judah and the things of Ephraim together, Ephraim, remember, knows who the Messiah is. Judah knows the tree of life, the Torah, but treats it legalistically. When you put those two together, you are destroying the Greek thinking that we've come up with, the sons of Greece. Some versions say the sons of Greece. That's what this prophecy is all about. And only now is it starting to come about, you see. Interesting that Yehuda provides, what does a bow do? When you pull a bow and arrow, the bow provides the energy that goes into the arrow. Judah provides the energy, the understanding of Scripture. Ephraim provides the impact. Because Ephraim, Scripture says, is Yahweh's firstborn. And there's a whole significance in that when you understand the place of the firstborn in Hebrew culture. Okay, so there's a little bit of prophecy that is only now coming about. But when we read that for a start, and probably years ago, I read that years ago, and I thought, I don't know what that's about. I haven't got a clue. Okay. Here's another one from Zechariah. Adonai Zvaot, which simply means Yahweh of hosts, says, "This may seem amazing to the survivors in those days, but must it also seem amazing to me?" Says Adonai Zvaot. Adonai Zvaot says, "I will save my people from the lands east and west. I will bring them back, and they will live in Jerusalem. They will be my people, and I will be their Elohim with faithfulness and justice." That's a prophecy that's still got to happen, of course. So it can't be old. Okay. What is it when he says, "I will save my people from the lands east and west"? When I read that, I had no idea what he was talking about, except, I suppose he's going to bring them from everywhere, whoever they are, because they're everywhere. But I had no conception at all that Israel, in promise to Abraham of multiplicity, had been scattered everywhere. And where had they been scattered largely? Well, we saw that, remember, in that section on history. They went from that region of the Middle East, right across through the nation of Parthia, up north into the empire of Scythia, right across to India, right down the Arabian Gulf, and from there, with the rise of those other nations, England and France and Portugal and so on, they've translated right around the world. But they started by going east. Another passage in Zechariah says, "I will whistle for them and draw them from the east." That's where they've been scattered to, in the main, through Africa and so on, through Carthage. So little bits like that, just snippets in some of the prophets, when you understand the history of Israel, suddenly make sense. House of Yehuda and the house of Israel, just as you were formerly a curse among the nations. Now I will save you, and you will be a blessing. Don't be afraid, but take courage. That passage there is written specifically for those today, like us. Okay. Another one out of Zechariah. This is a really interesting one. Zechariah was shown a vision, and the angel asked him, "What do you see?" So Zechariah told him, "Oh, it's a menorah." What's the menorah a symbol of? Anyone know? The menorah is a symbol of Israel, because Israel has the light for all nations, and the centre portion, centre light of that menorah